اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى
بسم الله الرحمن
آله
الرحيم. الحمد
وصحبه
لله حمدا
وسلم
كثيرا طيبا
تسليما
مباركا فيه.
كثيرا.
الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. We are at another of the applied learning seminars of the Sahba Seminary, and part of this seminar is presented in conjunction with the Majlis of Istanbul Muslims. Walhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless them and reward them for their kind and generous participation. In this ALS for Today Applied Learning Seminar, inshallah, we're going to be discussing the issue of propaganda and manipulation. But before we begin the actual discourse today, perhaps three short caveats, three short, perhaps quick statements to mention that can help guide our discussion. The first of those statements is as follows, that this seminar, inshallah, seeks to meet the needs of two groups. It seeks to meet the needs of those that are registered in the Sahba Seminary, as well as those people that haven't had the chance to learn or to participate in the seminary's curriculum. So it should be noted that what we will try to do is to present the material as it pertains to the issue of propaganda in a lighter, generic way, but nevertheless, it will comprise a lot of the core concepts that have been studied in the last year for those seminary students, this last year and a half. And so with that, what we're going to try to do is, inshallah, as we explore it, try to explore both of those deeper issues as well as the lighter issues, but in a way, inshallah, that everyone can take from it what, inshallah, is of benefit. So as we cover the issue of propaganda and manipulation, what we're going to be covering a lot of are issues, as I mentioned, that stem from the Sahba Seminary. So we're going to extract issues, if for those students that are from the seminary, that you will recognize as coming from the module on tazkiyah, purification. There will be issues that are extracted that you will say, oh, this is from usul al-fiqh. There are other issues that will be extracted that we can say this is from Sirah or Al-Haqiqa Al-Muhammadiyya ala sahibihi afdalus salatu wassalam, etc. For those students, it's important for you to recognize that and to pinpoint that and to note that as you are, inshallah, taking, inshallah, some notes throughout this course. Because what will happen is that as you review the material and as you look at those subjects with greater depth, you will understand the issue of propaganda and manipulation much better. That's a first point and caveat. The second caveat that bears mentioning is that oftentimes it's best to speak about propaganda and to speak about manipulation using videos and using clips and images. But because we're in such a special sacred space, we are not able to essentially show those. So if you would like any of the resources that are spoken about throughout the course of these sessions, please connect with me after, send us a message at the seminary, and inshallah, we will endeavor to give you some of those. Those videos and those clips and those articles are extremely important. It's one thing to talk about the manipulative nature of some modern technology, and it's another thing to hear one of the vice presidents of Facebook describe how he refuses to give his child that technology. It's very different. You get to see it more truly and accurately as it is. That's caveat 2. And caveat 3 is that in modern discourse and in some academic discourse, they make a distinction between propaganda and in the areas of persuasion and manipulation. But for the purposes of our discourse today, persuasion and manipulation will be used interchangeably, because what we're going to be speaking about are the negative implications of both, the negative implications of propaganda. And so with that, inshallah, a brief overview. This seminar will have 4 to 5 sessions. Each session will be approximately 45 minutes to 40 minutes in length. And the way the sessions will sort of fall is that the first session tries to give something of a very generic introduction to the idea of propaganda and manipulation. We want to start to understand it at a very high level. In session 2 and session 3, what we will try to do is build a framework in our minds to help us understand propaganda. It is insufficient for us as Muslims to simply adopt the paradigms that come from all over the world that try to speak to propaganda, but don't discuss it with an Islamic lens, because all of them end up being incomplete. So in session 2 and session 3, as we build out our understanding and mental framework of propaganda, what that will allow us to do is to be able to recognize it. It'll allow us to be able to assess it, and it'll allow us to be able to learn how to defend against it in, inshallah, a very robust and complete way. The fourth session that we will have is a little bit of a reflection on some case studies. We will be looking at 3, time permitting. The first is related to an individual whose name is Edward Bernays. He is considered to be the father of modern propaganda. The second is the de-Islamification of Sayyidina Rumi, and what has been done in terms of his discourse in order to de-Islamify its contents. And the third is actually about cell phones and technology. And that is probably the most important reflection and sort of session element to spend time with. The idea of technology and what technology is doing to us, and how it is in our current stage very much manipulating us in nefarious ways. So as you notice that when I spoke about these case studies, we have something about the progenitor of propaganda, and he is the one who named it public relations. We have something about literature, which is Rumi, and history, as well as religion. And then we have something about technology. And you'll notice that these are 3 very various and variegated fields of study. And what we're going to find as we go through and as we study and we look at propaganda and manipulation is we're going to find that actually propaganda and manipulation has roots in almost every field. It doesn't matter what you look at, you're going to recognize that there are elements of manipulation, there are elements of propaganda. I had a good discussion with one of our young students today where I said, tell me what you know about propaganda, since they were somewhat, let's say, interested in something else than attending the session. And he says to me, in all earnestness, that it's about the news, and it's about what the news is, and about the news being at sometimes, not discerning of the truth and being biased. And I said to him, yeah, that's true, and that's really good that you can recognize that. But the reality of it is that propaganda is something much more. It's much deeper. We as Muslims in our modern world, if we don't take the time to really reflect on it, to really try and ask ourselves, where is it and why is it impacting us in our lives, we will be sort of really at a very strong disadvantage to trying to combat it. The final session that we would have, a quick session, time permitting, is to explore some Q&A that inshallah participants might have. And so to begin, and as we begin, inshallah, what would be good is that if we can show the slides. And in the slides, on our first slide, what we're going to see is just a section, a verse of Surah Al-Fatiha. And that section, that short verse in Surah Al-Fatiha is Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. And that is the verse that we really want to take into our heart today. Because that is going to be the verse that's going to help us. It's going to be the foundation for us trying to understand propaganda and manipulation. If propaganda has some aspect in politics, if it has some aspect in marketing, if it has some aspect in business, if it has some aspect in technology, if it has some aspect in even the mundane elements of life, speaking to someone, going on a QA forum on the internet and seeing and asking questions and what propaganda might lurk behind there, we need something that anchors us in the reality of how we'll face it. And what anchors us in the reality of how we'll face it is Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. And this is something so important, and we're going to see as we explore, it's something that should help guide everything. And why is it that we ask for that supplication specifically throughout the day in Salah? Why is it that repeatedly, over and over and over again, are we going to ask Allah to guide us to the straight way? What is it that could be pulling us to the sides and to divergence and to deviation such that Allah commands us to ask that? And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to ask that repeatedly and repeatedly, shouldn't it automatically engender within me some semblance of there's something that's pulling me away? And what is it? That thus Allah, the Lord of the worlds, the creator of everything, tells me repeatedly over and over again to say this supplication. So that's the important element that we want to keep in mind. And when we look at Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, what we're going to see is that it is simply beautiful as a statement. It's so simple, it's so eloquent, it's so precise, it means so much, but it's also beautifully simple. That as the end of this, when we look at the end of our seminar perhaps, and we revert back to the issues of propaganda, then we will be able to see there's really propaganda everywhere. How do I face it? How do I deal with it? It could be in even the most simplest of things. It could be all around me in certain ways. And then we think, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, that becomes our anchor. That becomes that thing that's going to help us face propaganda, overcome propaganda, and inshallah do our best to help others to overcome it as well. And so now for an introduction. When we were looking at the title of this particular session, how it was written was as follows. We are inundated with obvious and subtle messages by those who seek to shape our ideas, attitudes, and choices. With the advent of modern public relations, how free are we? How much of us has been engineered? The purpose of the seminar is to expose the intents and methods of modern propaganda and to sharpen our minds to be on guard. And the real question that probably, hopefully, we're asking ourselves is, are we really in spiritual, rational control? Or are we shaped by puppeteers to act out a play of their own design? So when I live and when I act, and when I make my choices, how much of it is truly emanating from who I am inside because of a spiritual clarity and because of a rational clarity, and I seek to do things for my own benefit and for the benefit of others. And how much of the things I do in life are actually because I'm being nudged, I'm being pushed, I'm being given messages in various ways that are asking me and pushing me and sometimes compelling me to act in a way in which is contrary to even my own benefit. Now, oftentimes when we speak about propaganda and manipulation, the first reaction is that people kind of fall on a scale of propaganda, right? The one side of that scale is kind of like the crazies of the world, who have their conspiracy theorists that are completely outlandish, that are based on complete falsehood, and really, in many places, they're everywhere. In part of the research for this, I came across an interview in Wired magazine where the interview and interviewer are discussing this idea of conspiracy and propaganda manipulation. And he says that there's a stat that he gives. He says, I think this was in maybe the late 2010s. He says that at that time, it was something along the lines that YouTube had made 15 billion recommendations for people to watch this conspiracy theorist individual. 15 billion. So as we look at conspiracy and propaganda, on the one side you have this kind of it's insanity. But on the other side of conspiracy and of manipulation and of control and propaganda, you have those people that live in a kind of naivete. There's no control. There's no one telling me to, alter the way I behave. I have my own power. I have my own agency. No one can control me. And so there's the spectrum that we generally see when we speak about the issue of propaganda and of manipulation. But where we want to truly get to is, where does the truth lie? How can I, using data, using proper rational study, how can I better understand where it is that the truth lies about propaganda and its effect on me? Am I truly a free agent to do as I wish, or am I being pushed this way and that? And sometimes, as we live our lives, we're able to see the semblances of this kind of propaganda and manipulation. For anyone that has a phone, there's probably been a time where you've spoken about something, and then you've looked on your phone to, lo and behold, see an ad about it. Or you've clicked on something that you thought was interesting, and lo and behold, a short while later, while visiting another site, you see an ad for it. There's kind of like the subtle indication that there's something happening here. Someone or some agency or group or people is actually taking note of where I am and where I've been, and they're pointing me to do something, right? It might be innocuous, it might be buy a sweater, but it's still there and it's still present. This idea of manipulation and propaganda becomes more and more pronounced. Sometimes, for example, if we come across what are called financial forensic analysis. Sometimes you will see a map. They have these on the internet on various sites where it speaks about, for example, media control. Who controls the media? And how many people control these large conglomerates of media? Or, for example, financial forensics that relate to, for example, the government and defense, and how many people that have relationships with the defense industry are also people that are funded and vote for example, war. And so if you take a look at some of those graphs, when done accurately and when done properly and not in a state of paranoia, they truly indicate that there is organization. There is organization happening that is directing things in a particular way. Another thing that becomes we become aware of when we look at it is sometimes even just studying about institutions in life. So, for example, when you study about the history of public school and forced public education, one comes across a plethora of articles and quotations that speak to the really nefarious nature of forced mandatory schooling. So, for example, one quote that John Taylor Gatto writes about in one of his essays is, he says, H.L. Mencken, who wrote in the American Mercury for April 1924, that the aim of publication is not, to quote, to fill the young of the species with knowledge and awaken their intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The aim is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and originality. That is its aim in the United States and its aim everywhere else. And so he's a satirist, and there are arguments, and he speaks about the Prussian school system and what the Prussian school system was, etc. But here's an example about how in studying and coming across, modern institutions, we can find glimpses that are quite disconcerting, that indicate that, yes, in the world today, there are people with agendas. There are lots of people with agendas, and they're all trying in their own way to push their agenda. So as we live life, we begin to see and feel this reality. But, generally speaking, as we live life, we don't see that. We don't feel that. As you go about your life, as you do things, how often do we truly feel that there are people and there are institutions and corporations that are trying to affect us negatively? And in reality, when we think about that, is that not probably the epitome of good propaganda? That we don't think that it exists, that we don't think that they are impinging upon us. We don't think that the things that they're orchestrating in various ways have an effect. That's really a really profound achievement that they've done, that even in the nature of propaganda, we live our lives in general thinking that we are completely free and not subject to any of that. And so when people look at propaganda and look at control, oftentimes they say things like, people don't have that kind of power. What do you mean? If someone had an ulterior motive against me in my life, I would be able to see it. I'm not, quote unquote, ignorant, to use a polite word. I can know if someone's pulling me this way or pulling me that way. And really, how bad could it be? Another argument that people leverage. So for example, how bad is it if I spend a little bit of extra time on Instagram? Is it really a big deal? So the way that people interface with the idea of propaganda and manipulation is oftentimes to sort of play it down, to make it seem something trivial. But let's look perhaps at a few examples of propaganda and how it manifests in various ways to start to realize really how awful it is and how problematic it is. And so, for example, what we would like to do, just briefly, is to look at an article. And this article was written, I think, late 2010 or so, probably a little bit earlier, maybe 2016 or 17. And it's written by someone in the field of product development. And basically what he's writing about is he's writing about a video game. And so he's writing about the video game, and the video game that he's writing about is called Destiny. And so I don't want to read the full article just because of time, but I want, if anyone is interested in, getting the article and getting these sort of links to it, please do. This is a very useful article to read. I think that any parent that has a child that has some interest in video games, this is a really important article to read with them and to explore with them. And so, for example, he says in the article, and I'll read a few sections. If you've been paying attention, you might have heard of Destiny, the latest game from the folks who created the blockbuster Halo series. Oh, you've not heard of that either? Okay. Well, put it this way. It's a video game that cost a rumored $500 million to make. Now, as product folks, so he's a product developer, he says, we know a budget like this doesn't come without a rock-solid guarantee of a sizable return. So it's no surprise that at every turn as I've been playing Destiny, I've noticed elements of engaging SaaS, software as a service, product design, aimed at increasing investment with the game. So then he speaks about the critical reception of the game. People have given it varied reviews, but what he says is that the unanimous review is that this game is very, very addicting. And then he speaks about the purpose of the game, which is simply, you go, you shoot aliens, you keep shooting aliens, which is essentially the whole premise of the game. But then basically he says he wants to know why it's so uniquely addictive. He says, to answer this, I'm going to apply two theories relevant to how addictive products are made. The Zarnik Effect, named after the Russian psychologist Bluma Zygarnik, and the hooked model created by authors and entrepreneurs Nur Eyal and Ryan Hoover. So then he explains what the Zygarnik Effect is. And he says, in 1927, Zygarnik discovered that incomplete or interrupted tasks are remembered better than completed tasks. They create an itch in your brain that needs to be scratched. What's now known as the Zygarnik effect. Examples of this effect in action include a long, carefully composed email sitting unsent in your drafts folder, a phone call interrupting the climactic scene of a good movie, a sheet of bubble wrap sitting there only 2/3 popped. And then he has this image, and I didn't want to show it, but I'll describe it for you in his article. And the image that he has in this article is of two people covered completely with bees. Okay? And he writes, I don't know about you, but my skin feels like there are bugs crawling all over me right now just from writing those things. So you get the picture. So the idea here is that when there is something incomplete in your brain, it creates an itch inside of you. And you're like, I need to complete it. I need to complete it. And so he cites these examples of things that are incomplete. And basically what happens is he showcases, these two people that are covered with bees to showcase how horrible that feeling is to have things that are incomplete. And then he goes on to discuss how in the game Destiny, there's so much of this. So for example, in the article, he speaks about the use of completeness meters. So it's the idea that you haven't completed everything. You've only completed a certain percentage. And you need to complete the full percentage for that itch to be removed. And once you complete that percentage, guess what happens? There's something else. Then he speaks about the fact that you have upgrades. So as you're playing this game, you upgrade your armor or your gun or whatever the case might be. But the moment that it's upgraded, guess what? There's something else to upgrade. Then there's the idea of leveling up as a player. So all of these things are structurally built into the game to make it more addictive for you to play it. So here I am facing an incident in life. If I am in that state of naivete, I think, hey, it's a simple transaction. I'm putting in some time and I'm getting fun out of it. But the reality of it is that the rules of the game have been completely rewritten to my disadvantage. I don't know all of what is being engineered within the game itself to render it so addictive to my use. Then he speaks about the hooked model, which is another model that they've developed to create sticky, what they call products. And the hooked model basically says you have a trigger, you do an action, you get a reward, you need to invest. It's sort of like two O's stuck together. And so he basically says that throughout the game, you'll see this hooked model in action. You'll see that it uses internal triggers and external triggers. So internal triggers are boredom. I'm bored, I decide to play it. An internal trigger is camaraderie. Why is the game set up so that you play with friends? Why is it that you play with your friends who now you're always trying to outdo and outbeat? And then he says that they're internal triggers. You get an email, you get a push notification on your phone. There's the idea of announcements of events that are taking place that you have to join. All of this makes you take an action and you get a variable reward. The reward isn't always constant. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, sometimes you die, sometimes you don't. Then there's the idea of sometimes you find some kind of treasure that the alien leaves after you kill him. Sometimes you don't. all of these things are structured in such a way such that we become hooked. So here's an example of manipulation that's taking place at a very practical level as I engage with something that tries to change the way I behave. And it's a whole science. And I'm starting with the light example. By the end of the seminar, when we get to technology and what the technologists write about how effective technology is, how it rewires the brain, etc., it's truly a scary and really haunting discussion. So again, when people look at the idea of propaganda manipulation, sometimes they say, we'd see ulterior motives. If someone had an ulterior motive, we would see it. So an example that really should completely destroy this idea of that naivete is another example, and I'm using 2 games in a row, please forgive me, but that is of Pokémon Go. So Pokémon Go is this game, I'm sure maybe some of you know it better than I do, right? Like you have to capture this creature called a Pokemon, and then you train it, and then it grows, and then it does other things, and then you have a Pokemon gym where you train it to become better, and sometimes you have battles with other people. So in, the early 2010, shortly thereafter, they released Pokemon Go. So this is a game that by 2019 had earned, in 2019 alone, okay, $1.4 billion in revenue in 1 year, okay? And as of 2019, the game was downloaded over 1 billion times, right? So you can imagine this game. It's got these like cute creatures. You're trying to capture them. You're trying to play against other people, etc. Now the thing is that when you look at what data Pokemon Go collects, it collects the following. It can find accounts on your device. It can find contacts on your device. It knows your precise location, GPS, because it's an augmented reality game. It's a game where you go out into the world and you turn on your camera and you scan scenarios and you play, quote unquote, in the real world. So it knows your precise location. It knows how to modify and delete the contents of your USB storage. It reads the contents of the storage on your phone. It can take pictures and videos, and then it does other things. It affects your Bluetooth. It can control the vibration on the phone. But based on all of that, what does Pokemon Go know about you? It knows where you are, where you're going, what route you took, when you were at each of those locations, how long it took you to go from one to the other, what you are looking at right now, what you look like looking at that thing, what you were looking at in the past, right? And probably to a certain extrapolation, what you intend to look in the future. So this is Pokemon Go. So in 2024, in the end of 2024, the company that owns Pokemon Go, Niantic Labs, they published a press release. And in their press release, and I'm smirking and laughing, but it's the worst of things that you realize that make you laugh sometimes. They publish their press release where basically what they say is that we've been building a 3D map, an AI 3D map of everything that's been coming in, right? So all of the pictures that people have been taken, they've been sort of stitching them together. They've been building maps based on this because you would scan an area. And one thing that they say with respect to these maps is that it can pinpoint elements within the map with centimeter level accuracy. Okay? So I'm not going to get into some of what's written about Pokemon Go. Needless to say, there's some tech authors that write about its seed funding. And its first seed funding was by who? It was by the investment arm of the CIA. Okay? Now, just imagine that. How is it that I can prevent, for example, someone coming into my home and taking and knowing everything in my house, knowing all the books that are on my bookshelf, knowing what I read, knowing what I eat, right? All of that, and now you have a game, right, whose manipulative behavior, whose behavior behind it, although it's seemingly quite, benign, I'm going to go capture a Pokemon, is building a 3D map of the world and its environs with near centimeter level accuracy. So could it be, and I'm not saying that they do this, but for argument's sake, to show you where the consequences lead to, could it be that if I play Pokemon Go, there's a perfect representation of my home on some computer? If I took that in my house, of the people that are in my house, there's these perfect representations of those people. How does that happen? It's complicated. It's not a simple issue, the issue of propaganda and manipulation and what people are doing with the technologies that are there. And it's not enough for us to simply say, oh, that can't happen. No one's going to be that nefarious. No one's going to be that evil. When we can clearly see that things are happening in the world that truly are that horrible. And in the same way of it's complicated, one only needs to look at the news. And the news is probably the simplest, greatest example of propaganda and manipulation in play. And one looks and one sees what is said about Gaza, what is unsaid about Gaza. And in fact, probably, if we wanted to, this whole ALS could simply be about the actions of the Israeli government and how it uses propaganda in nefarious ways to dehumanize and to criminalize and to punish and to exact extreme amounts of aggression on an innocent people and populace. But needless to say, there's this beautiful statement of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, who said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating those who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppression. And finally, this idea of how bad could it be? If I spend a little bit of time extra on Instagram, is it really something bad? And let's remember that what is sitting behind a lot of what we see in terms of the manipulation and propaganda taking place is very heavily tied to money, right? In 2023, the revenue for Facebook was $134 billion. Its valuation as a company, $911 billion. Its number of employees, almost 20,000. And so what underpins a lot of, social media and what was used to justify social media, especially at its inception, were very powerfully beneficial calls to action. Social media gives me a voice. Social media will connect me with my family and friends. It will create like-minded communities. It will enable small to medium businesses to reach their customers. And all of that is true. Social media does allow us to do those things. But the reality of it is that the real intent behind social media and social media algorithms is one of attention, where the goal is, how long can I keep you on the platform? That's what the intent of the corporation is. The intent of the corporation is that the longer I keep you on the platform scrolling and looking, the more I can feed you ads. The more I feed you ads, the more I will be able to get ad revenue, the more my company benefits. And so that's my objective. My objective is to maximize the time that you're on this platform. And so the result is that they have an ulterior motive. They stated another motive, but the reality is that the negative effects are all too many and all too numerous to count. So for example, in a very brilliant documentary that everyone should watch closely and carefully, it's called The AI Dilemma. They speak about how in this first interaction with AI, and AI is essentially in that first interaction was based on the idea of recommendation, that it's going to recommend something for you. And that's how social media works to a large extent. It's the recommendation of things for you to see. Watch this next, look at this video, what about this, what about that, all to keep you on the platform such that in keeping you on the platform, they maximize ad revenue. So some of the deleterious effects of this result of this rush to the bottom of the brainstem, as they call, to keep you attached, to keep you scrolling, and to keep you looking at are the following. Number one, information overload. There's just so much information that people become overloaded. Two, depression. That the more I see people that are living not real lives photoshopped through filters, etc., the more I realize I want something that I can't have, that leads to depression. Three, anxiety. I become anxious because I don't have what other people have. Why are other people, so happy and I am not? It leads to addiction because now I am addicted to the idea of likes, and I justify my life by how many likes I get on a post. Then it leads to doom scrolling. The idea of just sitting and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. It leads to influencer culture, where we take our cues from people not who have ilm and knowledge and righteousness and piety, but rather we take our influence from people that have a following. It leads to the sexualization of kids. And what happens to that? It leads to QAnon, conspiracy theorists. It leads to shortened attention spans. It leads to polarization in society. It leads to bots and deep fakes. It leads to cult factories. It leads to fake news. It leads to the very breakdown of democracy as we have this proliferation of fake information. So all of this is not about extra scrolling, but rather it's about if I am being manipulated in ways, how do I recognize what that is and how do I fight against it? Because the effects for them and the effects of that negative manipulation are serious indeed. And so the question that we ask is, from all of the decisions that we make, what are the invisible forces steering my decision? Why do I wear what I wear? Why do I eat what I eat? Why do I hold certain beliefs to be true? Why do I vote the way I vote? Why do I hold certain values? How much of that is because I've rationally, spiritually come to the right conclusion, or how much of that is because I am pushed? And everything that we see nowadays has this impact of persuasion in it. If I read anything about the conflict in Palestine, which is news, if there's an advertisement for a sugary cereal, if there is a Coke alternative because of the boycott, there's still challenges with that. What are the challenges with that? As I was walking in the streets of Üsküdar just a few days ago, I saw an ad for the Turkish version of Survivor. What's the propaganda in that's there? If I pick up a textbook and that textbook has no mention of Allah's name in it, what type of propaganda exists by removing Allah, the creator, the sustainer of the worlds, from any discussion of science and of his creative power? When I look at the New York Times bestseller list, again, what is being promoted? So propaganda and persuasion, they're like, in many ways, Russian dolls. You keep pulling them open and pulling them open. And how does one get a handle of that? And the challenge is that, in the documentary on AI, he speaks about the rubber band effect. The idea that when you pull a rubber band, you stretch it, but the moment that you let go, it comes back and it becomes, quote unquote, what it normally was. When you look at propaganda and you see all of the myriad ways in which we are pushed and influenced to do certain things, to behave in certain ways, to spend money, it's like pulling the rubber band. But the moment we take our eyes off of the fact that there's so many people that are after our attention and after our money and after our values, it goes back and we think that it's normal. And so we have to stay stretched. We have to pull that rubber band and try to, our best, see propaganda in the world around us. And so As a definition for propaganda, the traditional definition was ideas, facts, or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage another cause. The definition of propaganda changes in the early part of the 1900s, in particular through Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is the father of modern propaganda. He's called the Great Manipulator. He lived from November 22nd, 1891 to March 9th, 1995, till he was over 100. He was the uncle of, or he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So he defines propaganda as the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. And in many ways, this change of the old definition to the new, it's just propaganda, right? The essence is the same, but it's now more sophisticated. It's called public relations. But as a science, it's still studied, it's still researched, and it's still funded, and it's still growing. Now, to understand propaganda, we can look at it perhaps in two ways. There's the idea that when you have propaganda, you have a stated objective, you have the real objective, and then you have the median on which you're going to push that objective and the tactics that you'll use. And finally, you have the effects. On any of the examples that we stated earlier, you can use that to sort of state what was the real objective, what was they really trying to get at. When a social media company purports its platform, what are they really after? Your intention. What might have been their stated objective? Well, it's to just, keep you connected with your family. And what were the tactics that are used? The idea of recommendation engine to encourage you to stay on the platform, the idea of likes and comments and people liking it. How does that create the cycle of usage, etc.? Another way to look at propaganda is to look at it in terms of what are some of the tactics in propaganda. And some of the tactics that we see in propaganda is the idea of vilification, demonization, generating doubt, distraction, alternative offering, and it goes all the way to threat and aggression and direct confrontation. All of those are ways in which propaganda manifests itself in our world. And we're facing a very difficult task now, because now as we try to face off against the onslaught of propaganda around us in all of these different ways, there is a rising storm of propaganda and persuasion. And that rising storm of propaganda and persuasion is the mixture primarily between technology and manipulation and propaganda. And so for those, what we just said, those are the definitions and they're the sort of core components that we look at propaganda. But in terms of what challenges we're facing is that now propaganda is science and data driven. So nowadays, they do studies that speak to when does dopamine fire in the brain, how does it fire, which is the chemicals that make you want to seek and make you happy and give you a sense of satisfaction when you've achieved something. And all of this is studied and documented at the level of scientific study. And it's all data-driven. And so this is now added to persuasion. Then the idea now that it's technology-focused, that they use technology in order to help persuade and market and manipulate. And what does it mean now? That a camera can be pointed at you, and as it's pointed at you, it can recognize the state that you are internally by the constriction or dilation of the veins in your eyes. It can tell how stressed you are, whether you're suffering, whether you're feeling constricted, whether you're feeling at ease. And what does that do in terms of sending the messages that they want to send? Another problem with modern day propaganda is that it's highly personalized. Now, before you would have a propaganda ad, in the old days, Mussolini, as one of the ads shows, he's sitting on a boat holding the steer of the boat, the steering the wheel of the boat, looking off in the distance. That's a message sent to everyone who sees it. But nowadays, if I open my phone, that message is now personalized to who I am, perhaps what I like, perhaps in the colors that I prefer. All of this is how persuasion becomes much more problematic. And then also with the idea of personalized, there's the idea of forced pervasiveness. Before, propaganda was in a sign that I saw. But now if I carry a phone and when I open up my phone, I see news recommended to me. I open up my app and it says, oh, you should watch this, you should see this. I go to YouTube and this forced pervasiveness of, oh, I need it for work. And now that accessibility is everywhere. So now before, in earlier times, propaganda was when I saw an ad that was placed on a wall. Now propaganda is in my pocket and I choose to lift it out of my pocket and to read it and to sort of view it very often. Then there's the idea of complexity, which we discussed, how to truly know what is being sought and used from our data and how that manipulates us. And there's this concept of exhaust data, the extra data that applications produce that companies then use against us and use to manipulate us in other ways. And then there's also the idea of creeping gradualism. How do we understand this vast change in societal norms? I was looking at a chart just yesterday and even this morning. It had basically 2000 to 2025. And in that, it charted our views with respect to marriage, with relationships between men and women that happen outside of marriage and their acceptability morally. And the increase in these last 24 years has been a 20% greater acceptance of that. And then with respect to same gender relationships, that increase was 30%. How does that happen? This idea of creeping gradualism, society becoming more and more willing to accept that which is around it and that which it sees. And so therefore we come to, for example, the text of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, where he says, "La takunu imma'atan," that do not be an imitator, do not be one that follows. And then even if we were to take a look at the first revelation that Allah revealed to humanity, it was Iqra, read. Read the world as it is. Bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. By Allah, for Allah. Not with your nafs, not with your shahwa, not with your caprice, not with your intellectual mail and tilt, but rather read it because Allah created it and He wants you to read the signs that are in creation. And therefore, when Islam comes to us as a deen, it comes to liberate us. La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the utmost slogan of freedom. It's the freedom to be free from the manipulation of others, both at the level of physical manipulation all the way to spiritual, intellectual manipulation. All of it comes under the gambit of what Islam is, because Islam seeks us to reach our potential that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for us. Allah wants us to be happy. Allah wants us to be free in His worship, such that I am not a prisoner of anyone or anything else. And so that's why propaganda now, something we understand, something of its definition, something of its qualities, something of the challenge that it faces now in this modern world, and the importance of recognizing its virulence now through these changing dynamics, but also to recognize that for us, we were created to be free in the worship of Allah. And in that we will find happiness. And so this concludes the first session, inshallah, just giving a brief introduction to the idea of propaganda. And inshallah, we will take a 5-minute break and then return to start to speak about the religious Islamic foundations that help underpin our understanding of freedom, manipulation, and the path that we take in order to truly become free. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.